Hello and welcome everybody to a new video from Jörg, Juggler66, Hour of the Truth. Today we have the 5th of March 2018 and I've come to the table to read to you the next part of the secret history of the Jesuits. But, as I announced already in the last reading, the 25th part, this is not of the book The Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmond Paris. This is an additional reading that I'm going to read to you from the book The Real Odessa, written by Uki Goni, and that is published in 2002. That book deals with how Perón brought the Nazi war criminals to Argentina. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the back flip of the book, that you have an idea what the book is all about, and then I go into the business of why I am reading part of this book during the reading of The Secret History of the Jesuits from Edmond Paris. This groundbreaking work of investigation by a courageous Argentine journalist unravels the complex network that allowed hundreds of Nazi war criminals, including Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, Erich Priebke and Klaus Barbie, to flee to Argentina at the end of the Second World War. Among other shocking revelations, it shows that the escape operation had tentacles in Scandinavia, Switzerland and Italy, and relied on the enthusiastic support of the Vatican and President Juan Perón himself. The book has now been updated to incorporate new research and includes a new foreword, conclusion and afterword. Richard Overy from the Sunday Telegraph writes, breathtakingly sinister, the stuff of every post-war spy novel. Goni, against all the odds, has dared to expose these bleak truths about his own country. Historical honesty shines through the pages of one of the most dishonest episodes in European and Latin American history." Unquote. And then there's a quote from the Irish Times that reads, "Goni has filled in a missing chapter in the story of how the dying Third Reich threw its living tentacles around the world, crammed with fascinating, sometimes gruesome details." From the Times of the United States of America we read, "Uki Goni's 5-year search for collateral evidence led him to files in Europe that confirmed a true story more gripping than Frederick Forsyth's fiction." Unquote. You know, Frederick Forsyth is the novelist who wrote the Odessa files, and that novel was then put into a movie and got quite famous, and Uki Goni therefore called his book The Real Odessa. And we have two more quotes coming. One is here from the Scotland on Sunday. "Remarkable and shocking. Goni has had to dig deep in files so filthy he sometimes needed gloves and a face mask." Unquote. And from the New Statesman we finally read, "Not only a fascinating exposé, but an essential document in a country that needs it." Unquote. Now, I'm of course not going to read the whole book to include that into the secret history of the Jesuits, but I'm going to tell you that some of the things that I commented on in the reading of the secret history of the Jesuits is of course taken out of this book, out of this knowledge of the Vatican Red Lines, which this book deals most and for all with. Next to the Vatican Red Lines, of course, you also had the escape route of Operation Paperclip, where most of the German Nazi war criminals then fled into the United States of America. And there started a new life in the CIA, the Catholics in Action, the Knights of Malta founded intelligence agency of the United States of America. One of the most famous is probably Werner von Braun, who worked for NASA and helped them developing rockets to play to you the ratio studiorum theater of landing on the moon, which you all believe. Now, in the beginning of this book, there's also a few more quotes, but I spare you to read that, and I will turn to chapter 3 that starts on page 25 in the book. I have read the book for about 40 pages, so I'm quite into this third chapter already. You know, the first two chapters are called, let me see, there's a table of content somewhere here. There's the foreword, and then we have war games. Oh, that's already the very first chapter. Yeah, I don't know, is there a table of content somewhere here? I don't even see it. I don't even see the table of content, at least not in the beginning. Let's see in the back if we have that there. Documentary. This book is very well documented. Ukigoni went into many archives all through the world. He left the last 50 or 60 pages of this whole book are only notes, and then it's called here the bibliography of the book that he used, documentary sources, bibliography, and notes that he used for this book. But there's no table of contents, and I can read to you what are all these different here it is. Different chapters. The first chapter is called War Games, and then the second Perón Leaps to Power, and then Undesirable Immigration. And this is about what I read so far. Undesirable Immigration is interesting to read in the viewpoint of the secret history of the Jesuits, especially chapter 6 and chapter 7 of the Infernal cycle that we read just before this one is coming out, because that deals with the war criminals in Germany at that time, and it deals also with the so-called persecution of the Jews. And well, you know, when there are people persecuted in their quote-unquote own country, or in a country or even a continent they live in, and then they flee to other countries and beg for asylum, and those countries close the doors, I think that is a very interesting fact, and that is what undesirable immigration from page 25 on leads to. Then, of course, you also had the abandonment of Argentina Jews, which is the next chapter, and the extortion of the Jews, which is the next chapter. And so Ukigoni spends 3 chapters on the Jews and how they wanted to flee the persecution in Europe that, we are told, led to the Holocaust. Yeah? And the point is that we have to understand that a lot of Jews tried to flee from that persecution in Europe, and the other countries just closed the borders. So, we are now reading on page 25, Undesirable Immigration, speaking about the immigration of the Jews. On January 20th, 1942, the chieftains of the Nazi killing machine met at number 56 and 58 in Wannsee, Berlin. That's an address like you have 10 Downing Street in London, yeah, used the seat of the government in the UK. Number 56, 58 Wannsee, that means that is the seat of the government in Germany at that time, to discuss the quote-unquote final solution of the Jewish question. For the benefit of those present, Reich Security Main Office Chief Reinhard Heydrich reviewed the progress so far. Schutzstaffel or SS Lieutenant Colonel Adolf Eichmann, head of the Office for Jewish Affairs, took notes. Gestapo Chief Heinrich Müller sat nearby. You know that the chief of the Gestapo and the SS together was Himmler, but the Gestapo of course had its own chief, and that was Heinrich Müller. Heydrich said that he had been entrusted with the task of cleansing German territories of Jews. For this he had to a. make all necessary arrangement for an increased immigration of the Jews, b. direct the flow of the immigration, and c. speed the immigration procedure in each individual case. Heydrich had been able to show some results. A total of 537,000 Jews were sent out of the country between the takeover of power and the deadline of October 31st, 1941. But immigration was not only a German problem, but also a problem with which the authorities of the countries to which the flow of immigrants was being directed would have to deal, and the Nazis had run up against a wall. the rest of the world was closing its borders to the Jews. Now, think of this in the light of 2018, where I, sitting here in Belgium, in Europe, reading this to you, and you maybe do not follow the European policy that much, but here in Europe we are overwhelmed, I can say. We are infiltrated, no, we are actually overrun and being conquered by Islamic quote-unquote refugees. Refugees from countries like Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, even Turkey. Yeah? People come here, Muslims come here, and say that they are refugees because they are persecuted in their own country and they fear for their life. So Europe opens the doors and lets this flood of immigrants in. In the time during and before the Second World War, the Jews wanted to get out of Germany for the same reasons, and then it says here, the rest of the world was closing its borders to the Jews. So we today over here open up, and then at that time for the Jews everybody closed its doors. The point also that I'm reading this to you is to help you understand that this persecution of the Jews was needed. It was needed for the agenda of the papacy, the Antichrist of this world, because they needed to found a nation state of Israel. And why do they need to found that? Well, because the Antichrist is, according to the Roman Catholic Church, not the papacy, but someone who will come in the far future, and then will reign for 3.5 years, and then will make a covenant with the Jews and end the sacrifices and oblations, and then make a covenant with them for a certain time. That means the Roman Catholic Church and the whole world is playing a theater on us, who are spectators in this, to replay Daniel's 70-week prophecy from Daniel chapter 9 verses 24 through 27 that Jesus Christ completely fulfilled 2000 years ago. But of course, for the Roman Catholic Church, the Jesus Christ of the Bible is not their Jesus Christ, because they believe in Tammuz, the sun god of Babylon, the reincarnated Nimrod, and that is their Jesus. And they don't accept that Jesus Christ fulfilled the Levitical law, the Mosaic law in that time. As Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, I come to fulfill, and that's what he did. He was the perfect lamb, but neither the heathens, and nothing else is the Roman Catholic Church, nor the Jews in that time accepted that. The Jews, because they were betrayed at that time, and they are betrayed today too. So, but when they want to play a theater of a future Antichrist, who will be a Jew or be a Roman or whatever, doesn't matter, and he goes into the temple and he seizes the oblations to, he makes the oblations to cease and the sacrifices to cease and to stop, and to make a peace treaty with the Jews. Therefore you need to have a homeland for the Jews, don't you? And at that time there wasn't one. So they had to found a nation state for the Jews. And that is why you had in the end of the 19th century the starting of the Zionist movement with Herzl, who was Jesuit trained. Oh yeah, bet you didn't know that, but that's very important knowledge. So with this, what are the right words to say this? With the starting of the Zionist movement, to found a nation state for the Jews who were scattered all over the world, since in 70 AD the 10th Roman Legion completely destroyed the temple and Jerusalem, they needed a new nation state. And therefore they needed persecution, because the Jews were sitting in Europe and they were quite comfortable. They had good jobs, they had good lives, their family were nice, they were prospering. They didn't want to go somewhere in the desert, stand there and build all up from scratch. That was not their intention. but when you are persecuted, you are maybe willing to go. So because of that agenda, that there needed to be a nation-state of Israel, that there the Antichrist can place himself, which is not the real Antichrist, but a puppet for the papacy. That is the real Antichrist, the papacy that is. They needed a nation-state of Israel, and therefore a persecution of the Jews. How could that be when all the countries open up and leave the Jews in? No, only one place was left to them. Go to Palestine, and there start the new nation-state of Israel that was founded in 1948 by, many people will say, the Rothschilds. Well, I don't deny it that the Rothschilds had a big hand in that, but we have to remember that the Rothschilds are the guardians of the Vatican treasury. So in the end, the Rothschilds are just Hofjuden, Jews who sold out in the court to serve the papacy, the Antichrist of the Bible. Doesn't matter that they built Israel over there. It's actually Rome who does it. The Rothschilds are just a puppet on the outside that you see and you don't understand. Because, as Tapasorsi said in his book Rulers of Evil, who would ever suspect an Orthodox Jewish family to be the guardians of the Vatican treasury? Right, not so many people. So, Yukigoni says here, the rest of the world was closing its borders to the Jews, because it was absolutely necessary for the Jews whether to be persecuted and killed or to go to Palestine. Now, pre-war immigration as a solution had been hampered by financial difficulties, and as the demand of various foreign governments for increasing sums of money. The lack of cooperation from foreign countries and the hefty bribes demanded from Jews by the diplomatic representatives of these countries had been a real stumbling block. The restriction of entry permits or the cancelling of such increased extraordinarily the difficulties of immigration, said Heydrich. After the start of the war, there was therefore a shift away from immigration, and another possible solution had taken its place. Heydrich now announced plans for, quote, the evacuation of the Jews to the east. Approximately 11 million Jews will be involved in the final solution of the European Jewish question. Now, what is the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe? That is an interesting question, right? Now, the source where this is taken from is the Wannsee Protocol from the 20th of January 1942, reproduced in the Holocaust Selected Documents in 18 volumes, volume 11, the Wannsee Protocol and the 1944 Protocol on the Auschwitz by the Office of Strategic Services from John Mendelsohn, published in New York, 1982, pages 18 through 32. I'm just going to read this one footnote to you that you understand how very well documented this book is. Now, the point that I want to make is the following. Heydrich says here himself, the evacuation of the Jews to the east, approximately 11 million Jews will be involved in the final solution of the European Jewish question. I hope that you understood every word that I was saying. The final solution of the European Jewish question is the evacuation of 11 million Jews to the east, not the gassing or otherwise killing of these Jews. I hope you get that right, because there never was found an order of a quote-unquote final solution for the Jews in mass killings. That document never popped up, at least not at that time, maybe a forged one later on. Here Heydrich says it himself. The evacuation of the Jews to the east means approximately 11 million Jews will be involved in the final solution of the European Jewish question. So what is the final solution of the European Jewish question? The evacuation to the east, Palestine. Okay? there was probably no country which had taken such extraordinary measures to cancel its entry permits for the Jews as Argentina did on the eve of Hitler's Holocaust. This shameful policy is one of Argentina's best-kept war secrets. Fortunately, despite careful cleansing of Argentina's Foreign Ministry and Immigration Office archives, some of the relevant documentation has escaped destruction, and the families of diplomats who served in Europe during the late 1930s and early 1940s clearly remember the secret directives against Jews fleeing the Nazi horror. At the time, Argentina's rulers saw themselves as standing at the helm of a predominantly white, Catholic Hispanic nation unjustly forced to share borders with its mixed-race neighbor in South America. An Argentine is an Italian who speaks Spanish but thinks he's English, is how many Argentines would define themselves. And the old saying was not far from the truth. The sparse native population of this vast territory on the southernmost tip of South America was decimated first by Spanish colonizers and later by the newly independent nation's voracious generals. Those still alive in the early 20th century had virtually disappeared under a wave of Spanish and Italian immigrants who, along with a fair smattering of French, English, Irish and German settlers, turned the nation's capital, Buenos Aires, into the Paris of South America. The fact that the mix of 15 million inhabitants included Jewish settlers, totaling 500,000 people, was something the Argentine establishment first preferred to ignore and later attempted to correct. And here we go into another footnote, number 65, so let me just look that up in the back of the book. It says here, for a comprehensive study by the German embassy in Buenos Aires of the Jewish community in Argentina, see its 27-page report, Die Judenfrage in Argentinien, which means the Jewish question in Argentina. 10th of January 1939, captured German Foreign Ministry records, and then follows a few numbers and letters giving the that you can trace that. See also frames and so on for Jewish population estimates and a review of immigration policy regarding the Jews in various other South American states. And now I'm done with the footnotes, I think. You get the point. This book is very, very well documented. Now, where was I? Just have to pick up here where the footnote came into play. And see that is somewhere on somewhere here in this. Oh yeah, it was the end of the page 26. Then I'm gonna continue on the next page here. I'm sorry. A succession of medallioned saber-rattling dictators and weak civilian presidents rode the back of fraudulent elections during the 1930s and early 1940s. They forged an alliance with the Catholic Church that reached its culmination in the Colonel's Revolution that catapulted Perón to power in 1943. The Colonels, eager to legitimize their self-appointed role as quote-unquote saviors of the nation, heaped favors on the Church, allowing it to realize some of its oldest and dearest aspirations. Chief among these was the compulsory teaching of the Catholic faith in all the nation's schools, a concession to the country's prelates that ran contrary to Argentina's liberal constitution. The church hierarchy in Argentina, with encouragement from Antichrist Pope Pius XII, began to harbor the illusion that a truly Catholic nation was in the making. Argentina's liberal tradition had slowly declined during the 1930s, and the reins of power passed to the hands of an anti-liberal amalgam of ardent nationalists steeped in Nazi mythology, young colonels outraged by government corruption, and elderly bishops nostalgic for a reunion of, listen, church and state. This blend led to the attempt to impose a quote-unquote new Christian order in Argentina. The colonels who took power in 1943 carried their Catholic devotion to extreme lengths, elevating the Virgin Mary to the rank of general in the Argentine army. In return, the bishops blessed their Nazi-style parades, ignored the excesses of Perón's military regime, and supported the colonel's social policies. A particularly Argentine strain of anti-Semitism was part of the mix. To this mindset, Germany's Nazi regime was actually a tool of the divine will. Quote, Hitlerism, paradoxically enough, is the antechamber to Catholicism, unquote, wrote Father Giulio Mainvier in 1940. This priest was the leading light of Catholic nationalism in Argentina. Spain, under General Franco, was becoming Christian, means Catholic. He declared, adding that the terrible German boot assured the purification of France. The anti-Christian structure must be destroyed. That is precisely the great service that unknowingly the Axis is providing the Church. Unquote. Again, the reconciliation of Nazism and Catholicism was the driving spirit behind the Argentines' elite's alliance or dalliance with Hitler. Even though the country's nationalist Catholics declared themselves opposed to the tremendous persecution of the Jews in Germany, their disagreement was one of degree, not of substance. Father Mainvier's 1936 bestseller El Judío, The Jew, defined this attitude succinctly when it stated that, quote, we Christians, and I'd like to remind you that you should understand that as we Catholics, must love the Jew in accordance with Christ's precepts to love even our own enemy, unquote. The book managed to systemize Argentine anti-Semitic thought while at the same time declaring itself against Nazi-style racism. Quote, we must love the lepers, but this does not prevent them from being isolated to prevent contamination. We must love thieves, but that does not keep them from being jailed so that they do no harm to society, unquote, the book held. Hitler's pogroms were wrong. What was needed were special laws that took into account the, quote, theological dangerousness of this race. They must not be exterminated from among the Christian peoples as the anti-Semitics pretended, nor must they be granted equal rights as liberalism would wish, unquote. Mainvier's influence was long-lasting, and in the 1960s his book was reprinted without alterations. So did the world learn? I don't think so. It was through such perverse reasoning that Argentina convinced itself it could obtain an undercover alliance with Hitler that took into account the country's Catholic and Hispanic roots while circumventing Hitler's overt racism. As the German embassy in Buenos Aires reported to Berlin in 1938, Argentina's Spanish ancestry had left the country too heavily brushed with the Semitic tar brush to expect any but the kind of religious anti-Semitism espoused by Mainvier. Unquote. Against this backdrop, on July 12, 1938, Argentine Foreign Minister José María Cantillo bent over his desk and signed a secret directive that was the equivalent of a death warrant for thousands of European Jews. Wired that day to all Argentine diplomats around the world, Directive 11 was labeled, quote-unquote, strictly confidential, and its contents have never been revealed until now. The secret order came only a few months after Germany's annexation of Austria and had placed 200,000 new Jews at Hitler's mercy. It was designed specifically to ensure that none of the German and Austrian Jews fleeing Hitler found their way to Argentina, and thus bears out Heydrich's justification at Wannsee, that the cancellation of entry permits by foreign countries had proved immigration a non-viable solution to the Jewish question. It instructed Argentine consuls around the world to, quote, deny visas, even tourist and transit visas, to all persons that could be considered to be abandoning or to have abandoned their country of origin as undesirables or having been expelled, whatever the motive for their expulsion, unquote. In the dark climate of pre-war Europe, Argentine diplomats knew the clumsily worded order defined one particular group of humanity over any other: the undesirable Jews expelled from their homes by the German Nazis and Italian fascists. The order anticipated that Jewish refugees were unlikely to reveal their true status before hard-nosed Argentine diplomats and advised consuls to apply their own, quote, conscientiousness and sound criteria, unquote, when evaluating borderline cases. To ensure that they erred on the side of rigor, Directive 11 warned that the zeal applied to each evaluation would enable the Foreign Ministry to, quote, establish the functionary's aptitude for the post, unquote. In other words, their jobs were on the line if any undesirables slipped through the filter. These instructions are strictly confidential and must not for any reason be referred to before the public or before the authorities of the country of posting, the order concluded. Directive 11 did not come alone. It was issued secretly to underpin new publicly announced restrictions to Argentina's hitherto fairly benevolent immigration law. This tightening of the cordon around the country's border was decided on because Buenos Aires correctly feared that the persecution of the Jews in Europe would push them towards Argentina, where a sizable Jewish community already existed. First of all, Decree 8972 lifted the quaint exemption from visas that first-class passengers had enjoyed until then, based on the belief that immigrants only traveled second or third class. Many Jews and even communists had discovered the first-class loophole. The government realized, and it was time to plug it. Secondly, and more importantly even, a new system was introduced starting in October, whereby only the Immigration Office would have the authority to authorize landing permits. From now on, immigration officials in Buenos Aires would judge applications on a case-by-case basis, relying on the personal information forwarded by the Argentine consulates in Europe. Consuls, therefore, lost their discretionary power to stamp visas based on their own judgment. Pandemonium broke loose on 30th of July, when the decree was made public. Argentine consulates around the world were flooded with applications from Jews wishing to get in before the October deadline. In Buenos Aires, the Immigration Office was also bombarded with applications for landing permits presented by Jews in Argentina for their persecuted relatives in Europe. Expecting this rush, Argentina had taken preemptive measures. As well as the secret Directive 11 on July 12th, Argentine consulates were secretly instructed to apply the October changes as if they were already in force. The day the decree was issued, the Immigration Office stopped issuing landing permits altogether, and by August 25th it took the more expedient course of simply closing its doors to the public. There was some mild opposition to the decree in Argentina. Mild opposition. In Congress, a small group of legislators demanded explanations, particularly concerning instructions to consuls to ascertain the religion of applicants. Foreign Minister Cantillo defended the new restriction, saying that refugees could not be considered immigrants and should therefore not be admitted. Now, this is a sentence I have to mark in this book. This is a sentence we should use in Europe today about this invaders that are coming here to Europe today, right? Foreign Minister Cantillo defended the new restrictions, saying that refugees, I'm gonna mark this right here, right now, where you don't see that. I'm gonna read it to you again. Refugees could not be considered immigrants and should therefore be admitted. Not be admitted, sorry, not be, of course. Yeah? Refugees could not be considered immigrants and should therefore not be admitted. The restrictions were also defended by conservative legislators, including future Peronist Vice President Vicente Solano Lima, who questioned the legitimacy of any Jewish presence in Argentina at all. "We don't want the ghetto here," he brayed. When a vote was taken in December over whether Congress should consider actively cooperating with other governments to further the arrival of Jewish immigrants and their settlement in this country, too few votes could be raised to bring the issue to the floor. But there was no concerted effort by the large Jewish community in Argentina to oppose the new decree. No protest march was organized to match the week-long business strike that a Jewish umbrella group, the Delegation of Argentine Israelites Association, initiated at the end of November, when news of the Kristallnacht atrocities in Germany reached Argentina. You know the Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night? That is the night that is called when the Germans put fire into the Jewish synagogues and started really violently persecuting the Jews in the streets. That is the Reichskristallnacht. I think that was October 10th, 1938, but I'm not sure about that. Alarmingly enough, on that occasion the Argentine authorities reacted by sending out the police to draw up a checklist of business that had closed in sympathy with the Jews. The Foreign Ministry in Berlin received a detailed report stating that 1,474 stores had shut their doors. Too much of the Argentine press was in quote-unquote Jewish hands, the German embassy in Buenos Aires concluded. For the local Jewish community, aware that it was under such ominous surveillance, immigration took a back seat to the more immediate threats of rising anti-Semitism and the growing Nazi presence in Argentina. Finally, the well-entrenched nationalist elements in the country won the day. Quote, "The Semitic invasion must be opposed," unquote, trumpeted the nationalist paper La Fronda. The combined effect of Directive 11 and Decree 8972 was calamitous. Immigration to Argentina fell by almost half. The number of legal Jewish immigrants plummeted from 4,919 in 1938 to 1,873 in 1939. Safe refuge was not guaranteed even to those Jews who managed to slip through the net. On February 25, 1939, the SS Contingent docked at the port of Buenos Aires carrying 68 refugees. A few days later, tearful relatives saw it pull away again, carrying its precious load back to Europe. On the same day, the SS General San Martin arrived with 27 refugees, of whom only 2 were allowed to stay. Identical scenes were repeated time and again during the war. Surviving records show that during 1939 alone, some 200 Jews on 23 different ships were dispatched back to Europe. The actual number may have been far higher. Despite instructions never to refer to the existence of Directive 11, some consuls did mention it in their communications with the Foreign Ministry. Thus, in August 1942, the consul in Barcelona informed Buenos Aires that a group of 27 Jewish refugees, including children who had obtained visas from Paraguay and Chile, were seeking transit visas to Argentina, so that they could travel to their final destinations overland by train. The consul felt it his duty to make sure these visas were denied because of their race and because of Directive 11. He also wished to warn Buenos Aires of the migratory movement of Hebrew families from Central Europe to our neighboring countries. Argentine consuls posted in those countries should be careful, the consul said. The Foreign Ministry responded with instructions not to issue visas to the group and to forward all such cases in future directly to Buenos Aires. Directive 11 was followed by other secret restrictions. In November 1939, for example, Foreign Minister Cantillo instructed consuls to refrain completely from forwarding any Jewish applications to Buenos Aires. Cantillo reminded the consuls that Jews should not even receive tourist visas. Some Jews were filling in application forms at various consulates simultaneously, the minister warned, fudging their data in different ways in the hope that one application might slip past the steely eye of the officials in Buenos Aires. These new orders obviously reflect the zeal invested in preventing Jews from entering Argentina. But they also stand witness to the fact that many consuls were charging bribes for entry visas, and that Buenos Aires was aware and displeased. Selling visas to Jews became a kind of cottage industry for some Argentine diplomats. While this was many notches in the scale of infamy below the kind of ransom extracted by the Nazis, the Argentines based their extortion on providing loopholes to their own directives against the Jews. And while the ransom money extracted by the Nazis went partly to state coffers, Argentina's diplomats operated mostly on their own account, cashing in on the century's most solid business opportunity. The Argentine consulate in Milan, Italy, attracted a great deal of trade, according to Eugenia Lustig, an Italian Jew from Turin. With her Milanese husband, managed to obtain an entry visa there in 1939. The Lustigs were fortunately high-status professionals. Mrs. Lustig was a doctor, her husband a Pirelli executive. Quote, "We couldn't work because of Mussolini's race laws," she told me. Ukigoli did own interviews with survivors. Yeah? "We couldn't work because of Mussolini's race laws," she told me. "The Italians made us let go of the domestic help, 2 sisters with us for 30 years, who couldn't understand why. The Italian police took our radio because they didn't want us listening to the BBC at night. The building superintendents were all fascist spies. Then the Germans came. After that, you died." Unquote. The Milan consulate became a rendezvous point for Jews of many nationalities on their way to the United States or South America. Quote, "It was always full of people, Jews from Germany, Jews from Poland, passing through Italy," said Lustig, who was in her late 20s at the time. There weren't many native Italian Jews, but they were all trying to get to Argentina. A great number were fleeing Central Europe, It was a terrible moment. I arrived in Buenos Aires in August, just 4 days before the war started." Unquote. Many were turned away at the consulate, either because they could not afford the bribe, or because Directive 11 was being applied. Quote, "Jews were clearly not wanted. It wasn't said expressly, but it was talked about. So much so that many people went instead to Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, countries that did issue visas, moving from there little by little into Argentina." Unquote. Among the Jews in Milan, word got around that bribes had to be paid. Quote, "What price for an Argentine visa today?" Unquote, was the standard question on the street outside the consulate. Quote, "But the real and foremost problem was they didn't want Jews." Unquote, recalled Lustig. The refugee from Turin went on to become one of Argentina's leading cancer experts, but not before being subjected to additional humiliation. Quote, "After the war, Peron still didn't want to recognize my Italian medical degree. Unable to open private practice, Lustig applied herself to pure scientific research at which she excelled. One day, Peron's health minister, Ramon Carrillo, called her on the phone. Quote, he said he was sending a young man over who wished to look at the research I was doing. The young man turned out to be a recent arrival from Germany, but he didn't stay long at Lustig's laboratory. He had to leave early to attend his private practice. I have medical permit signed by the minister," the smiling German explained. My grandfather, Santos Goni. This is the author speaking. My grandfather, Santos Goni, who had served as Argentine consul in San Francisco, Vienna, and Genoa during the 1920s and 1930s, was well aware of the existence of the secret directive and applied it rigorously during the early 1940s when he served at the Argentine consulate in Bolivia. The daughters of Eduardo Labugle, Argentina's ambassador to Berlin during the 1930s, also clearly recall the existence of the secret order and the headaches it caused their father. Neither of these two diplomats could have been considered pro-Nazi or anti-Semitic, but they did combine a sincere dislike of the Nazis with a marked absence of sensitivity toward the plight of the Jews. They were both career diplomats imbued with an old-school sense of obedience, and the orders they received were very clear. My grandfather, posted to La Paz from 1939 to 1944, had to deal with a large number of requests from Jews who wished to enter Argentina from Bolivia. Dismayed by the difficulties in obtaining visas for Argentina and Europe, many Jews traveled to neighboring countries and sought to enter surreptitiously from there. My grandfather was particularly struck by the case of a beautiful young woman who emptied a purse of jewels on his desk and, failing to impress him this way, stripped off her dress and offered her naked body in return for admission. Unable to get around my grandfather and Directive 11 in Bolivia, Jews resorted to other means. Many died attempting to cross the border with Argentina on foot, murdered for their belongings or abandoned to their fate by the guides they had paid to lead them over. Others resorted to the safer method of bribing train inspectors and border guards to allow them to ride hidden in the wagons crossing to Argentina. One of Perón's closest friends and collaborators, the Nazi-saluting General Juan Pistarini, got wind of the fact that Jews were using the trains and moved to block their access. Another close associate, Colonel Juan Filomeno Velasco, who was chief of the federal police, ordered an investigation into, quote, the gang leaders bringing Jews into the country, unquote. Ambassador Labougle in Berlin, posted in the eye of the storm, had to deal with singularly painful problems produced by the secret order. He found it difficult to get his consuls to apply Directive 11 at all. The ambassador suffered venomous criticism, particularly from his consul Labougle's oh, that's a strange word, I have to say, I'm very sorry. Punctiliousness. Okay. Particularly from his consul in Hamburg. The ambassador suffered venomous criticism, particularly from his consul in Hamburg, Bartolome Danieri, who felt he was a martyr to Labougle's punctiliousness. Ambassadors in other European cities were allowing their consuls to grow fat on money extorted from the Jews, and Danieri was peeved at being excluded. Quote, Father knew the consuls wanted to profit from the secret order and had forbidden them to charge the Jews for visas, unquote, recalled his two daughters during an interview for this book almost 60 years later. Nonetheless, it was well known in Hamburg that the Argentine consulate sold visas to Jews at 5,000 Reichsmarks a piece. 5,000 Reichsmark, look that up, what that is valid in the time of the war, what that value was. And then you get an idea that as a normal Jew you did not have any chance to bribe anyone to get out of there. The ambassador's insistence that the directive be obeyed, Directive 11, did not stem from any Nazi sympathies. In fact, his career was cut short partly because of his failure to toe the covert pro-Axis line followed by successive Argentine governments. Quote, when father returned from official receptions in Berlin, he and mother, both still in their gala clothes, would send off ciphered cables to Buenos Aires, warning of the Nazi threat, unquote, his daughters recalled. But the cables ended up in the foreign ministry waste paper basket. Labougle resigned from his diplomatic career in 1942, precisely because he disagreed with Argentina's neutrality in the war. While the foreign ministry archives still hold many of the cables in which he correctly warned of the growing Nazi threat and the effort by Berlin to indoctrinate German citizens in Argentina, others have disappeared down some dark government channels. One cable in particular, dated 1940, warning Buenos Aires that a personal friend of Adolf Hitler was entering Argentina from neighboring Chile, was removed from the foreign ministry files altogether and is now hidden in the restricted access basement of the Ministry of Interior. Unquote. This is, it's not a quote, but here again is a footnote. Sometimes I see that as a quote, sorry. Interesting, right? Through what work this author does to dig out all these papers, even quote-unquote hidden papers, because it says here, Marlina and Delia Labougle, so the daughters of that ambassador, interviewed by the author on the 5th of April 1999, both retained vivid memories of their days in Berlin with their father. Labougle's warning regarding the arrival of the Eichhorn couple in Argentina was sent from Chile, where he was transferred after Berlin. In 1997, a copy of this cable still survived in the Interior Ministry basement on a cabinet shelf a few steps away from a giant green shredder machine. Dossier R2, file 139, reads the footnote. And that's why I just read this to you. On the last paragraph on page 35, the author continues saying, other diplomats diplomats had their own peculiar proposals for slowing the growth of the Jewish community in Argentina. In August 1941, a plea by the British government for 20 Jewish German children residing in Britain to be allowed to join their relatives in Argentina failed miserably. Argentine Ambassador Thomas Le Breton refused to issue them visas. An attempt at personal intervention by Lord Winterton, a personal friend of Le Breton, failed to sway him. Jewish children, quote, were exactly the people whom the Argentine government did not want to have in the country, as they would eventually grow up and would help to increase the Jewish population by propagation, unquote, Le Breton argued, as Winterton informed the Foreign Office. Quote, in fact, he said emphatically that he would only grant visas to them if we were prepared to have them sterilized before they went there, a task which I told him was quite beyond our powers to effect, unquote. The secret orders made it practically impossible for Jewish refugees to enter Argentina except through circuitous illegal routes. After 1941, hardly anybody else was able to get in, recalls Marcelo Fuhrmann, a Jew from Vienna whose brother had been among the last to slip into Argentina in 1938. He himself had to wait until after the war to obtain a visa. Immigration Office statistics back Fuhrmann up. The number of second and third class transatlantic passengers who were willing to state their religion as Jewish upon arrival in Buenos Aires plunged from 2006 in 1941 to a dismal 60 in 1942, falling further to only 26 in 1943 and to one solitary passenger by 1944. And with this I will stop my reading of Lucigoni's book, The Real Odessa, Chapter 3, Undesirable Immigration, and we will conclude probably next time this chapter and then retreat back to the book reading of The Secret History of the Jesuits by Edmond Paris. But I personally find this very important to include this reading, what I'm just reading here, into the secret history of the Jesuits, to give you an even broader view on the facts that when Jews wanted to flee Europe because they were persecuted without any doubt, other countries, in this case Argentina, closed its borders by secret and open directives. Yeah? And that is something that we have to understand. Germany is always put at the boogeyman of the World War, of the Second World War. And Germany was persecuting and killing people. I'm not taking any way away of that. I'm not washing them white. That's not the idea. But we have to understand that Germany only was a tool in the hands of the Vatican, and that all the other countries agreed on that and played along, because they are all, or they were all, tools in the hands of the Vatican. And since World War II, nothing has changed, my dear brethren, and that is the message of this and all the other readings that I'm doing. Inquisition is coming upon all of us. That's why Tom Friess that's why Tom Friess calls his ministry Inquisition Update. We are trying to warn people that history repeats itself. So with the secret history of the Jesuits combined with the real Odessa of Ukigoni, I hope that you get a history lesson that you can make sense of what is happening today and will probably happen in the future. That you understand this. When you hold this to the Bible and then all of a sudden you understand Bible prophecy because you see it fulfilled in history that has never been told to you in this truth as you can hear in these readings, or in the readings that Tom Friess does on Inquisition Update, because you have been deprived of a real education. So, this was this part, and next time we're going to continue and close this up and then continue in the reading of the secret history of the Jesuits. I thank you all for watching the video, listening and commenting, and until next time, Juggler66 from Hour of the Truth says, God bless you and bye-bye.
Especially I work in dealing with the infiltration of churches and religious institutions as well as government that cover a tremendous number of institutions.
And the purpose of that infiltration was what for?
Well, the purpose is what the Roman Catholic system has all the time as her own purpose, is to infiltrate, to penetrate all the areas of life where the Roman Catholic can have control and access for the coming world government.
Simply put, this country and this world benefit from your commitment to Jesuit principles, to being men.
As a graduate of another great Jesuit institution, Xavier University, I have great affection for the value and purpose of a Jesuit education.
What that means is, in preparation for that world government, the Roman Catholic institution, especially since the establishment of the Jesuit order in 1541, throughout all these 500 years, they've been in preparation and through infiltration and penetration of every level of society in order to take over the world politically and religiously.
What a beautiful day the Lord has made. Holy Father, on behalf of Michelle and myself, welcome to the White House.
There are two doctrines that define very well these dangerous goals of the Roman Catholic institution. Two doctrines define this very well. One is called the doctrine of the apostolic succession, and that is dealing with the papacy. And the other is the doctrine, the temporal power, and that is dealing with world government. Of course, both, because you can see that even the Pope and his own individual office, he meet those requirements. He is not only the head of his church, as he called himself, John Paul II, the present Pope. He said he is the pastor of his church. He is not only that, but he is the head of his state.
It is a sign, perhaps, of how far we have come in this country that today's news of formal recognition between the governments of the United States and the Vatican did not create a furor. Once upon a time, it would have. Once upon a time, and not all that long ago, it did.
From the time of President Washington, there was the first president to be utilized by the Jesuits. If you were not aware of that, President Washington already was initiated by the Jesuits to bring about the first communication with the Vatican ever known in this country. From there on, President Reagan, throughout all this time, President Reagan has come to fulfill the greatest moment in the history of this conspiracy.